And so what I want to do here is talk about what I call the three peaks of suffering in 2 Corinthians. Now, I'm going to do a quick flyby of this concept. I do an entire webinar on this. I'm only going to give you a few minutes, so I can't give you all the detail, but I want to give you a brief overview so that you can, one, have a new appreciation for 2 Corinthians, but more importantly, that you have a better grasp on this idea of suffering. And the first one is 2 Corinthians 1:8. This is the first mountain peak in 2 Corinthians. This is the passage of Scripture where Paul said, he told the Corinthians that I don't want you to be unaware, I don't want you to be ignorant, I don't want you to be misinformed about the suffering that we experienced in Asia. And so when someone comes to you and they start talking about your suffering, your hardship, your difficulty, what you're going through, you want to make sure that they are not ignorant, that they are not unaware. And Paul was telling them, I don't want you to be unaware of what was going on. In fact, he said that God was pushing us beyond our strength, beyond our ability to fix the situation. Paul was keenly aware that he struggles with self-sufficiency. And he was also keenly aware that God is a merciful God and will not let him stay in this condition. Therefore, God was burdening him beyond his ability to rectify the situation, and that is what Paul did not want the Corinthians to be ignorant about. And so when someone comes to you and they talk about your suffering, you tell them, listen, I struggle with self-sufficiency. I'm a fixer. I have to be in control. I want to manage every situation. But God, in his mercy, he has sent a problem into my life that I cannot rectify. He is burdening me beyond my ability. Paul went on to say in this section here, in verse number 9, he finished by saying that God is teaching us to rely on him who raises the dead. And so we have to make that transition to where we're not relying on ourselves, self-sufficiency, and we're learning to rely on him who raises the dead. Therefore, God has brought suffering into Paul and his team's lives to teach them to rely on God. And then he transitions to the second mountain peak of suffering in 2 Corinthians, and he begins to reveal this juxtaposition. The juxtaposition is between a jar of clay and a treasure. And he says in 4:7 that we have this jar of clay, or we have this treasure, rather, in a jar of clay, and that is the juxtaposition. We are the jar of clay, referring to Adam, who was made from the dust of the ground. We are fragile, broken, imperfect clay pots, and God has chosen to put the treasure in the fragile, broken clay pot. And Paul tells us why in the verse. The rest of the verse says this, that we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the power belongs to God and not to us. And so God has to move us out of the way. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, he has to burden us beyond our ability to rectify the situation. He wants to make sure that we assume the position of a fragile jar of clay so that everybody knows that the power belongs to God and not to us. And then Paul moves on to the end of the book. This is the third mountain peak in 2 Corinthians 12. And he gives us a very real-life illustration of what he's been talking about in these previous two sections. The first two were maybe philosophical, possibly theoretical, but now he wants to talk about what really happened to him. Paul had this problem, as he tells us in this passage of Scripture, of being proud, specifically being conceited because of the abundant revelations that were given to him. And so God, in his mercy, gave him a thorn in the flesh. It came from a messenger of Satan to harass him. And Paul understood, and this is part of what he doesn't want the Corinthians to be ignorant or unaware of, that God brought this thorn of flesh and put it in the thorn in my flesh. He put it in my flesh so that he would teach me not to rely on myself, but to rely on him who raises the dead, to remind me that I am a fragile jar of clay, and the power does not belong to me, but belongs to God. And therefore, out of this broken vessel, and that God decided that he would never, ever remove this thorn from Paul, and Paul got it. As he said, God said, My grace is sufficient for you. Therefore, Paul said, I will rejoice all the more because of the persecutions and the calamities that come to me. And then in verse number 10, and this is the goal for all of us, he gave us the secret to the Christian life. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul found shalom. He found contentment in his weakness, and he told the Corinthians, I don't want you to be ignorant of what's happening to me. And so the next time when someone comes to you in your church meeting and they are talking about the difficulties that you are going through, you want to walk them through this. Of course, it needs to be practically real for you. You have to come to terms with this idea of a theology of suffering in your own life. If you don't, you will not be positioned to help people. Paul helped a lot of people. He helped a lot of people because of his weakness. Or you could say, more theologically accurately, you could say that God helped a lot of people through this jar of clay because the power was not competing with Paul. Paul assumed a position of weakness, thus the power was all the more magnified. The three peaks of suffering in 2 Corinthians. Now, if you want some additional help on this idea of suffering, I highly recommend this book that I wrote in 2018 called Suffering Well, a play on words, how to suffer well, because we don't suffer well. The subtitle is How to Steward God's Most Feared Blessing. Nancy Holman is a mastermind student in our program, and she's almost finished with our program. She lives in Enid, Oklahoma, and she read the book before it was published and reviewed it, and part of her review said this book can be used for personal devotions, used in a small group setting, or given away as a gift. It will bless the giver and the receiver. She said much more of that, and you can read her full review on our website. But I do recommend this book. It was 30 years in the making, and the things that I'm teaching tonight, the things that I'm sharing with you in this webinar, well, this book clearly articulates where I learned these things as I spent 4 years of my life reading the book of Job, wrestling through the most horrendous events in my life, and God began to teach me some of the things that I'm sharing with you tonight. So if you want to do a deeper dive, I do recommend this book, Suffering Well. I do want to take a brief coffee break and to thank many of you who support this ministry. You're the ones that make these webinars free. You're the ones that cause our resources to go around the world every day and reach hundreds of thousands of lives. And I want to thank you for supporting our ministry, $5 a month, $50 a year. Many of you support more than that, but you can do that. And if you are able, I would appeal to you, if you happen not to be supporting our ministry and you benefit from it and you believe in what we are doing, may I appeal to you, if you can, if you're able, to support us. It would allow us to do much more. I always have more ideas. There are always more needs than we are able to fulfill, and we only fulfill them when we have the ability to do it. And so if you're able to help us, I would encourage you to pray about that. And if you believe that's God's will, would you support us? Thank you so much for listening to my coffee break.